So David will talk through the scale and impact of deer populations. We'll then move on to how deer management supports land management and farm business objectives. And then we'll look at the practical application of deer management, as well as the funding that's available to support woodland creation, and as part of that, woodland management and deer management. And then David will talk us through potential markets for venison. I think, yeah, we're 2 minutes past now. So David, I'll hand over to you to take us through the scale and impact of deer.
Okay, thanks, Becca. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for inviting me down to the southwest of England for a day out. I'm sat in Suffolk, and there's the beauty of Teams and everything, isn't it? We can do it remotely. It'd be much more enjoyable, I'm sure, to be out in the field somewhere, but this is a very good mechanism for actually just getting out there and sharing some information. So I'm David Hooton. I'm the East and East Midlands area deer officer, but we still work supporting each other across the country as and when we need to. So my background is deer management. I spent 12 years working for the Forestry Commission up at Thetford Forest as a wildlife ranger, doing deer control, involved in squirrel control as well as hares and rabbits. So I've been involved in the nitty-gritty culling end for a good period of time. I then joined the Deer Initiative in 2003 and spent 17 years on the advisory side of the work there, looking at deer management populations, population monitoring, impact assessments, management planning, coordination, collaboration, landscape scale work. And one of my sort of pet subjects was venison, the venison markets, which, as most of you will know, are fairly torturous and come and go with the sort of the changing of the winds almost. So that's where I've come from. That's who I am. So I am now the deer officer for the East and East Midlands. We've got deer officers in each of the areas. And like I say, we tend to work together to do these events and provide advice and support. I guess most of you will know that deer populations have increased over the last 50 years. But where did we come from? And if we still go back to the Ice Age, there was only two native species, roe and red deer. They were the ones that were common throughout the UK. And over time, their populations were pretty much wiped out. We saw sort of fallow deer brought in by the Romans, Normans, and in between times from the Mediterranean as food and as parkland hunting animals. But by the late 1700s, there were next to no deer around. They'd been wiped out. And it was only the mid to late 1800s that we started to see the reintroduction of deer to many parts of the country. A lot of our roe deer have been introduced primarily from Germany, fallow into the parks and enclosures in the late Victorian era, from Mediterranean, from other enclosed herds in Europe. Chinese water deer muntjac, introduced by the Duke of Bedford back in 1890 odd. And their populations have been moved around the south of England, and they're bred really well, and now their populations are very, very widespread. We probably had remnant populations of red deer, New Forest, Quantox, Exmoor, Norfolk, Suffolk, and obviously Scotland, and their populations have been allowed to build up through that sort of interest in having deer populations on the ground over the last 50 to 80 years. So southwest England, what have we got? We've got Sika, red, roe, and Chinese water, muntjac, sorry, moving in from the sort of the Dorset area. So there's a good spread of deer populations increasing in number and range. But why have the deer populations increased? And really it's a sort of a combination of factors. We have really good weather conditions in south of England, very low winter mortality, very low fawn die-off, so really high rates of recruitment into the landscapes, really good food sources of food across arable landscapes, the arable crops, the hedgerows, the woodlands, which have increased in cover since 1900. People have moved them about. There's been a sort of a continuation of hunting across the time, but 1963 Deer Act helped protect the deer and their welfare. And the sporting interest has always been sort of sitting there in the background, which has probably allowed the deer populations to expand from their very low levels in the 1940s to where they are today. Sporting interests obviously very much focused on male deer stalking, and the populations of females have increased sort of exponentially away from that. Just looking at the range maps of these deer species, this is evidence from the British Deer Society, their range maps, and you can see the southwest of England there. Really good populations of roe deer, red deer increasing in number, and sika deer coming through, as well as sort of populations of muntjac. You'll know what you've got on the ground. If you haven't got them already, you're a good chance of getting them in the near future. Certainly up in my neck of the woods, up in east of England, we've got 5 of the 6 species of deer on a lot of the land, and certainly dealing with 2 or 3 across most of England. And their populations are increasing and continuing to increase. One of the things we spend a lot of time doing is looking at the impacts of deer on our woodland environments. Back in the sort of 2000s, we were looking very much only at woodlands and the woodland impact. And it was about recognizing what woodlands could look like if there were no deer in the countryside. And obviously no deer is not the answer either. It's about having a balance. But with limited browsing levels or lower browsing levels, our woodlands would look very different. And we demonstrate this by using exclosures. And these are sort of a variety of exclosures that we use across the country to just show what can happen if you exclude those mammals. I think that the sort of associated losses also, when you're losing that structure, has knock-on effects to other species as well, which we'll talk about in a sec. But when we're looking at woodland creation or woodlands back into management, establishing new woodlands, we need to think that the pictures here are not establishing woodlands. They are heavily browsed, and this is sort of commonplace across loads and loads of areas that we're working. They come out the top of the tubes and they get browsed off. Inappropriate tubes and shelters are a problem, but also look at the sort of the structure of the vegetation around those tubes. If you're trying to create woodland or have woodlands back into management, sort of establishing those new management processes, we really need to be thinking about that associated biodiversity and looking at the breadth and variety of species between the trees, because that's what other things feed on. When we're looking at associated impacts, we're looking at the sort of the floral interests. We're looking at the birds that are species available for birds to nest in. Butterflies love certain types of plants. So for the Norfolk Broads, there's Chinese water deer, and they feed on a number of plants that have very, very close dynamics to the swallowtail butterfly. Now, when you lose certain plants, you lose the associated fauna that lives within it. We've all seen declining of woodland birds for a variety of reasons, but the migratory species, if they do get back here in the spring, they need somewhere to nest that's safe, and most of our woodland birds like that sort of dense shrubby underlayer. And with deer browsing, we seem to be losing that, and we're losing it at an alarming rate. One of the things that really sort of makes me stand back and look is sometimes they're looking at the crop damage. These are mainly East of England focused, but Jochen Langbein, who's based down in the Quantocks, he did a lot of work looking at arable impacts from red deer back in the 1990s, and he was estimating that at that stage there was about 10% crop loss on some of their areas. We're losing a lot more than that here, where numbers have built up to very high levels. And when I say very high levels, I'm talking about hundreds and hundreds, and in one case, thousands of fallow deer moving across landscapes. And their estimated losses are in the hundreds of thousands and probably heading towards millions across the country. So what does good look like? As landowners, you'll probably know what a good crop looks like. We all see that as we're driving around. But woodlands, we seem to have forgotten what a good woodland should look like. And whether you're bringing a woodland back into management or doing a new woodland creation, we have a vision of what they need to look like and what's going to be good for them in the future. A dense understory, a variety of species, closed canopies and then open canopies if you're doing coppice areas. But we need growth. We need that restructuring. We need a ride network that's rich in flora, that's going to be good for your bugs, beetles, insects, butterflies, and the dense understory which will provide nesting habitat for the birds. This happens to be a fenced woodland in Suffolk. You wouldn't get woodland like that growing in Suffolk if you didn't put a fence around it. But the problem with the fencing is it only protects the bits the fence is round. It doesn't protect the rest of that landscape. And that's where we're seeing some very high impacts occurring. This is in Gloucestershire, so it's more towards the southwest of England. And this is unfenced, continuous cover forestry woodland on a large estate where they've got a very good deer management policy in place. And you do see some really nice regeneration of multiple species and a dense understory developing. But without the continued emphasis on deer control, this will not occur. And it's very easy to let it slip because a habitat like this provides lots of food, lots of shelter for deer, and actually deer can hide very well in it. So the management is even more crucial at this stage rather than necessarily the open woodlands. And this is Haldon Forestry England site. Again, you can start to see that sort of understory developing and a multi-species, multi-aged canopy. And that's sort of what good forestry looks like. Over the last 30 years, we've been involved in lots of deer monitoring. You'll probably know the species of deer you got on your ground, and you'll probably have a vague idea of numbers. We can only count what we see, and we always, or nearly always, underestimate the numbers and sheer volume of deer we've got in the landscapes. We've had some drone surveys carried out in east of England and other parts of the country, and we're really sort of looking at populations that are well in excess of what we'd expect to see. And we're looking at densities of multi-species now of 17 deer per square kilometre across landscape areas. If we go back 50 years, we did vantage point counts. We'd have 20 or 30, 40 of us out across a landscape and we'd count the deer we saw. If you did that today, you wouldn't count very many deer because a lot of our deer spend a lot of time in sort of very inaccessible habitats. So in that top right-hand side, well, the top pictures at the top there, left and right, is the Norfolk Broads. And you can sort of see the habitat we're dealing with: wet reed beds, thick woodland, very difficult to see into from the ground. So doing vantage point counts across those sort of areas is really, really challenging. We brought in thermal imagers, ground-based thermal imaging, back in about 2005, 2008. And again, you could sort of count those deer at night, much easier than with a spotlight. But again, you couldn't see into dips and hollows, and you certainly couldn't see into the reed bed habitats. So we always underestimated what there was. With the onset of drones, we've been able to have some very high quality cameras. You can see from these pictures of the quality we're working with now and the range at which these cameras will pick up heat sources. There's the middle right there. That was at about 1,000 yards. So you could really sort of see, and the bottom picture was a group of the stags from that picture halfway up the right-hand side. So you can see the range at which we're working, and it's just phenomenal what the equipment will do. So if you get the opportunity of doing drone surveys either at a site-based or landscape area, it's very well worth doing. When I was talking about cluster areas, I think it's really important to sort of look at our landscapes in their entirety. So look at the areas you own, look at the areas you've got influence over, and look at where you can join together different land ownerships to work together to understand what the impacts, threats, risks are to your landscape objectives. This area is northwest Norfolk. It covers 183 square kilometres. We counted 2,376 deer within it, and that is of all 6 species. And one of the challenges we have is where we have multiple species living in areas, because individually their densities may not be particularly high, but the combined browsing pressure is massive. And the right-hand column is the density of deer per square kilometre of that landscape. The highest densities are obviously associated with woodland, and the lower densities are either to do with the way the deer are managed at those sites, quite high intensive management, or it's because they've got very open habitats, so they haven't quite got the ground to hold deer on. All these deer, wherever they are in that landscape, though, will use a woodlands there. And the landscape in Norfolk, Suffolk has got about 6% woodland cover. If you extrapolate that and look at the sort of density of deer per square kilometre of woodland and the impacts likely, you're looking at 74 deer per square kilometre in that landscape. If you go to Scotland, the expected density to get natural regeneration occurring and establishment of good timber quality trees is about, well, it's less than 5 deer per square kilometre is their target. And at those sort of densities, you will get a little bit localized impact, but the majority of the species will start to grow and get away, and the vegetation growth will be adequate in establishing trees. I think it's important to also remember how much these animals are eating. One fallow deer is very similar to a sheep, and in these sort of areas, we're looking at those 2,000 odd deer eating 2,800 tons of vegetation a year. Now, this is across a landscape area, and this landscape has to provide all your objectives. So whether it's your crops, whether it's your trees, your hedgerows, your countryside stewardship, bumblebee nectar mixes, your pollen mixes, whatever it might be you want from that landscape, the deer will feed on it. And so the volume of they take out has to be over and above what you are providing. You wouldn't necessarily have 100 sheep running through your woodland or 100 sheep running across through your arable crops. So why are we allowing 100 fallow deer to wander through? So we have to really think about the management of these deer at landscape level and look at how they all feed. Muntjac are very selective in what they take. They like those delicate plants within the sward. Red deer, fallow deer, sika deer are more grazers, so they're going to be taking a lot of the delicate plants, but they'll also browse a bit heavier on some of the grassier species. But deer, all of deer species are dissimilar to the horses, the larger mammals. Horses, cattle, they're very much less selective. They'll take a great big mouthful of vegetation and they don't seem to affect it in the same way. So if you've got a selective browser, you will get a lack of diversity within the sward. If you've got cattle, pigs, horses at the right density in these landscape areas, they can actually be beneficial to the sward development. So how deer management supports farm business objectives? We really have to think about what the objectives are for your land holdings. That's the key question. What do you want from your land? And ultimately, we need an economically viable landscape. We want a landscape that produces money to support that farming business. That's the bottom line. But we also want to see that environmental improvement. We want to see landscapes that have high biodiversity value. We are one of the fastest depleting countries in the world for biodiversity. Now, as a developed nation, that seems crazy to me, but it's because we have a lot of pressures on our landscapes. We have to make money from the businesses, and the density of the populations, the other impacts we have, the roads, the railways, the increasing urbanisation of some of these areas, all affect what we're trying to deliver. But we do want to see environmental improvement. As landowners, you need to make that the farm food production. That's what you're there for. That's your job. Like my job is to sort of look after the deer population and provide advice. Landowners are there to provide food for the country. So you have to have your business working in a way that makes them function. We talk about a lot about woodland creation. Over the last 50 to 100 years, we have increased the amount of woodland across many of our landscapes. There is a desire to plant more woodland in the future to support the carbon question and the carbon issues we have, global warming. Woodlands are also really good for biodiversity, so that links very heavily with the second point of that environmental improvement, creating corridors between good habitats, supporting that network of habitats across landscapes, whether they're woodland, waterways, riparian, whatever it might be. There's a place for it all within our landscapes, and deer will affect each and every one of these objectives going forward if they're at the wrong density. We want to see new woodlands, but we also want to see the old woodlands managed well. We want viable crops coming from them. We want to make timber one of the key products going future in construction. There's a project at the moment looking at timber in construction, and they're focusing on how we can develop new products, from our timber resources. So everything we do will favour deer, all these landscape objectives. So what we need to think about is, how will deer affect what we're trying to achieve? And with all good risk assessments, there's a risk assessment matrix. So the impacts that deer cause, and then the likelihood of that presence. So if you've got low deer numbers and low deer presence or activity, chances are you'll have low impact. But we can monitor that, and we have to monitor it through activity and impact scoring. We look at the signs that deer leave behind, we look at the current impact levels to our features, and then we need to plan for action. So if you want to plant new woodland in an area, assess what deer species you've got, assess the activity levels, and if it's moderate activity, chances are that impact will be moderate to certain features. And when we're planting vulnerable species, we have higher risk. So we have to think about how we manage that risk, and we can talk about that in a sec. So I'd like to run you through a project I was involved with over in Suffolk back in 2005. I was working with the organisation at wood called Wolves Wood. And the impact assessment there was basically saying we've got a really highly impacted woodland, predominantly roe and muntjac with occasional fallow deer coming in. And the whole structure of that woodland was being affected by this continued browsing pressure from these two species. It is a triple SI. It was classed as unfavourable declining due to deer browsing pressure. So what did we do? Well, we looked at the protection methods and options. We've got deer culling, we've got deer fencing, shelters, chemical repellents, natural repellents. So they designed a sort of a suite of things in this woodland to help protect that structure. So they looked at the deer fencing within the woodland. It's a triple SI, as I say, about 35 hectares in size. So they fenced the coppice areas with deer fencing. They got some deer culling in place. They employed a local team of stalkers who were able to go in that were suitably qualified and suitably experienced. And they had high seats installed, and they had guys on the ground on a regular basis. What is regular? Regular is about getting in and putting in the amount of time you think it takes to control that deer population. Across the country, we're estimating it's somewhere between 5 and 8 hours per deer culled of time required to undertake that action. Obviously, when the deer population is much higher, it's going to be a shorter amount of hours per deer culled. And as the population reduces and the activity level reduces, that hourly rate will increase. There are also chemical repellents now. There's a chemical called trico, and it's made from a sort of a natural repellent. Well, it's a sheep-based fat chemical, and you spray it on the top of the plants, and it helps reduce that browsing pressure. People do put sheep's wool out as well, and that sometimes helps. A lot of these are fairly short-lived, and if you're putting tree shelters on or chemicals or anything else, you have to do it on a regular basis and make sure the tree shelters are at the right height. You can also get clip-on bud protectors. The one on the left is a Christmas tree plantation. They're using it to protect that growing tip. The other one is continuous cover of forestry plantations and plantings in Gloucestershire again. In the one on the right, it's fairly low density of deer, predominantly roe. And this seems to prevent the deer browsing that tip. It doesn't prevent the need for culling, but it does prevent the damage to those tips, and that means that you can get these trees to grow. Obviously very labour intensive putting them on, and it's not solving the problem of browsing to other species and other features within that land area. So when we're talking about deer culling, we're talking about the who. They need to be trained. We have deer stalking certificate 1 and 2. We have proficient deer stalking certificates as well. So we need people who are trained and experienced in undertaking deer control. We've got best practice guidance. Deer Initiative website still has 80 or 85 best practice guides on it, which basically takes you through all the deer stalking and deer management requirements you'll ever need. It's a good bedtime read, but you also got the sort of expertise of Forestry Commission, deer officers and woodland officers as well to revert back to as well. And please ask questions. I mean, at the end of the day, there's lots of resources out there that we can share and advice that can be provided by us and others to ensure that deer management is at the right appropriate levels for each holding. So who does the stalking? It's individuals who are trained, as I say, but it might be a syndicate, it might be day stalking, it might be volunteers, and there's a variety of models of paying for this to occur through contracts or voluntary agreements where there's no money changing hands, but deer stalkers are sort of going in there to undertake culls to the levels that you require for your land management objectives. And that's the key, that as land managers, you get the job done how you want it done and to the level you desire. And that's to meet your objectives. It needs to be landowner led. The stalkers are really good at what they do. And there's a matter of sort of making sure that the guidelines are clearly laid out about what it is you're expecting. At the end of 20 years, this woodland was improving, and it moved from unfavorable declining condition into pretty much favorable condition. And if you can remember back to that picture that we took 4 or 5 slides ago of that very barren understory, this is what it looks like now, or 2023. You've got more ground vegetation, you've got more variety of plant species, the flowering plants, there's better hazel growth. The browse line has disappeared predominantly through that area, and you've got sort of branches and leaves coming all the way down to the ground. That's as a result of effective deer management, but it's an absolutely ongoing process. You can never let your foot off the gas. And I go back and meet the owners every 2 or 3 years. We do an assessment, we talk to the stalkers, and we keep on pushing. What's really interesting there now is that predominantly it was roe muntjac with occasional fallow. We've now got the occasional red deer turning up as well. So you have to manage them again as part of your control program. And you can never stop looking and never stop checking. But what's really good is that there are examples where it is working effectively. The continuous cover forestry estate in Gloucestershire I showed earlier, this one here, it's working. And there are other examples where with effective control, you do get that vegetation returning. When we're looking at woodland creation and design, we need to think about building in the deer mitigations at the same time as developing our woodland creation designs. So where we've got the planting, we've got open space, might have some coppice areas, might have some public access, but we need to be thinking about where are we going to cull deer from, and where are deer going to come from? Because they're going to come from that wider landscape into your new planting areas. Is it appropriate to fence everything? Do we want to use tree shelters? Do we use deer stalking and control? And we'll use a mixture of operations. We'll use some fencing, we'll use some tree shelters, and we definitely need to do deer control. Because what will happen is that in 10 or 15 years' time, these areas, even if they were fenced at creation point, they will let deer in, and they will then become home to deer once those fences are removed. So we do need to be thinking about this as a landscape scale, working with a cluster group, working with landscape recovery groups, working together with just 1 or 2 neighbours to try and develop a what works for you in your situation. Fencing comes in a variety of forms. Some very high spec fencing that will hopefully last for many years, or more short-term fencing. Do we actually need to exclude deer for a long time, bearing in mind that deer will probably get inside a fence anyway? Or do we just need to keep the deer out for a period of time? If you're looking at established woodlands, it might be just the first 4 or 5 years of a coppice rotation. So electric fencing may be quite suitable. Running on a solar panel, temporary plastic fencing can work as well. Do we need to put tree shelters on trees inside a fence? My view is we probably don't. There may be good reasons too, though. If you're going to use tree shelters, let's make sure that those tree shelters protect those trees from the deer once they come out the top. I've seen a lot of places where you've got 75 centimetre wraps or 1.2 metres shelters where we've got fallow and red deer, and they'll come through and they'll just browse every top of every tree. In low density tree density deer activity areas, do we need to protect each and every tree? There's a suite of trees that are less palatable. So do we need to protect the birch? Do we need to protect the alder? Do we need to protect the oak? Which ones do we want to protect, and which ones do we want to put the funding to? Because it might be you can get away with tree shelters that are 1.2 or 0.75s for some species, and then put slightly better tubes on other ones. So think about your risk assessment, think about the species we've got, and think about how we can manage them effectively. A lot of deer stalkers will use high seats as well as stalking from the ground. With high seats, please make sure they're fit for purpose. They need to be safe for the person using them, but also if other people get into them and use them. We've all got woodlands where people walk on a regular basis. Everything we put on that ground has to be fit for purpose and safe. We don't want people falling out of them. The high seat in the bottom middle there is a galvanized freestanding high seat. That is what's funded through the schemes, both UCO, the England Wood Creation Offer, and Countryside Stewardship. We want freestanding galvanized seats or lean-to galvanized seats. We do not fund wooden seats for a variety of reasons, partly to do with safety, partly to do with longevity. The seat in the bottom right-hand corner, I feel has got too small a footprint. When you're sitting in it, it feels quite wobbly and doesn't feel safe. If you're using a firearm from a seat, it's got to feel safe. It's got to be appropriately built. The top right-hand corner is a bunch of high seats that's actually made in Germany, and they had a slight problem with wild boar over there, and they threw a load of high seats at it to try and sort the problem out. But they're very geared up for wildlife management in Germany and in Europe. We are here, we're developing ways of doing it, and it's a matter of just trying to make sure that what you use is fit for purpose. The technology available for deer stalking now and deer management has vastly increased since I started back in the 1990s. I started with a very small power scope on top of my rifle as a 270 rifle. We're now using 270s and 308s and all sorts of different calibers, but we've got the additionality of thermal technology as well, so we can actually find deer a lot easier. This equipment is not cheap. The handheld spotter in the top picture is best part of 2,500, a little bit more now. And the bottom one is a thermal clip-on spotter, so it goes on the front of your rifle scope. This means that you can see deer a lot clearer, and it's about using technology within its capabilities in the right manner. I wouldn't recommend it for everyone. I wouldn't recommend it for all circumstances, but the technology is giving us an edge where we can actually make a difference. All deer management's covered by the Deer Acts, 1963, 1991, 2007 Regulatory Reform Acts, and it covers the time of year when we can cull deer. We can only cull deer when they're in season. Predominantly it's females in the winter, so 1st of November through to the end of March. Muntjac can be culled all year round because they have aseasonal breeding. And then the male deer, fallow red seeker, 1st of August through to the end of April. Roebucks, 1st of April to the 31st of October. We have to maintain our deer culling in those seasons, unless we cull deer out of season under Section 7 of the Deer Act, which allows us to cull deer to prevent further damage or unacceptable losses to property and or crop. There's no license for that as such. It's a Section 7. It's a provide the evidence, and if you're questioned, provide that evidence to whoever is asking. You can get a out-of-season license to control deer to protect natural heritage or public safety. Night licenses can be applied for in season only, and they're applied for through Natural England again. Again, you have to demonstrate the impacts occurring, the likely impacts are going to continue, and start to sort of look at ways of managing those populations, and are you effective in what you're doing? If you're not, and you've got marauding animals, potentially night licensing might be an option for you. And there's obviously a regulation on caliber size and bullet weights that you can use for deer control. We cannot use thermal technology currently at night. When we're developing woodlands, woodland management, everything is underpinned by the UK Forestry standard. And within that, there's also a requirement that deer and other mammals are managed appropriately to manage our woodlands and our landscapes. We're here to try and promote timber production, biodiversity, diverse woodlands, but all with that sort of economic sway to it, I would suggest. And we're very keen that deer and other mammals are managed accordingly, and that's why the UK Forestry Standard has both deer and squirrels embedded within it now. So funding, what funding is available? The England Woodland Creation Offer has various amounts of money available to it. Obviously, the land has to be in England. It's free of existing grant funding, supporting a range of woodland types that you meet the UKFS. You can have joint multi-landowner applications. Ideally, I think going forward, we need to see and want to see sort of private investment within land woodlands as well now. And pretty much any scale of woodland size is now available. So minimum 1 hectare up to no maximum. And individual blocks can be a minimum of 0.1 hectares with a minimum width of 20 metres, 10 metres if it's a shelter belt or riparian zones. I'm not going to talk too much about this because you've also had webinars on this already, but just as a reminder that there is this offer and it's about as good as it's ever been. I've been involved for 30 odd years and I don't think we've seen offers quite as good as this for a long time. The UK funding comprises of 4 categories. You've got your basic capital items as standard costs for the trees and the protection, fencing and gates, ground and vegetation preparation, and various other features, including sort of woody dam construction, capped at £10,200 per hectare. Infrastructure support, recreational access, woodland management for tracks and stacking areas, drainage, and then additional contributions and a variety of additional contributions based on the environmental outcome, and that's a per hectare basis, up to £12,700 a hectare, and support for natural colonisation. If you're looking at natural colonisation, look at what's available or what's growing first and see what's going to be feasible. I've seen some very, very nice natural colonisation plantations over the last 20 years, and they are diverse and they're rich, but they're not necessarily suitable for everywhere. And then you get your annual maintenance payments, and that's a per hectare, £400 per hectare per year, and that's now for 15 years. Historically, it's for 10 years, but now I say it's for 15 years. And that includes the contributions towards you beating up your grass management and also your deer control. But the England Woodland Creation Offer also pays for elements of deer management. It doesn't pay directly for time. That's included in your £400 a hectare. But it does include deer exclosure plots. So if you're doing natural regeneration, if you remember those slides from half an hour ago, we've had those exclosures in the woodlands. You can put deer exclosures in, and that's to monitor how things change inside to outside the exclosure. The deer high seats are funded. We can't fund high seats if you're totally fencing your woodland creation offer, but if you are looking at open ground, if you're looking at areas where you're using tree shelters, we can support high seats there. They can be either freestanding or lean-to. And then shooting mounds, quite common in upland areas where you're doing mounding anyway to plant the trees, heaps of soil basically that you can use as shooting platforms. And then the trico, the deer repellent, is paid on a per tree basis. And where you've got low densities of deer, I've seen this work very effectively. Chatsworth Estate up in Derbyshire, they've used trico for a number of years now, and they're getting some really nice results of as the trees come out the top of the tube, they're giving them a dose each spring, and a lot of those are now getting away from the deer browsing elements. The other funding stream is the WS1. It's a countryside WS1 now. Some of you may already be in schemes, and the schemes are going to be continue to be rolled out over the next period of time. There's training available, training payments for things like deer stalking certificate 1 or 2, and the proficient deer stalking certificates, impact monitoring. We've got stalker payments at a rate of £105 a hectare per year if you've got eligible woodlands, and most woodlands will now become eligible. Other land areas where we've got deer impacts on that are vulnerable habitat types, so potentially moorland, reed beds, lowland heath, where deer impacts are high, we may be able to pay support for deer stalking time on those. We've got the high seats, both the freestanding and lean-to high seats, deer fencing of the appropriate specifications, the exclosures again funded. And going forward, there's some really nice projects being developed through the cluster and landscape recovery groups. And they have been able to get funding for and looking for extra funding through farmed and protected landscapes, because that fund now is available for a further year for deer larders, chillers, processing equipment, help with marketing, feasibility studies, drone surveys, impact assessments. So pretty much anything to do with deer management that's not currently funded by the training or CWS1, we can fund things at landscape levels. And I'd recommend that every landscape recovery project should have deer as a feature within it, because everything that project is likely to do, whether it's repairing plantings, connectivity of habitats, new woodlands, new hedgerows, floral meadows, wet woodlands, marshy land, all will be impacted on by deer. And if you're not getting the deer management correct, chances are these features will start to fail. So most of these landscape recovery groups are now looking at deer as an integral part of them. And like I say, you can get funding at national levels for some really good, expensive infrastructure. Venison markets. Well, where are our new venison markets? If you've been involved in deer management at all for the last 25 years, you will have seen prices fluctuating from the game dealers and a lot of moaning about lack of market potential. I chair the British Wild Venison Working Group. It's a group set up of the main stalking organisations, the AGHEs, the processors, and a lot of discussions with end market users. So the end market use here is venison grill steaks being sold in Aldi, Lidl, Waitrose in Scotland, Morrison's in the West Country borders, Welsh borders. And then you got venison dog treats and venison going into dog food. And that's sort of the new market spaces. And we don't really mind where the market space is for venison, providing someone's buying it at a price point that works. We have seen increases in sale of venison over the last 5 years. It's more widely acceptable, and it's sort of taking the place of some of our other meats. Everything we do around the sale of venison, though, is through the wild game guidance. This is European legislation that we've adopted. The latest review was in October 2024. And what we need to be thinking about is, what are we allowed to do? How do we sell it? And making sure we remember it's a food product from the point of shot right through to it ending up on someone's table. One of the reasons that the end consumers and the big buyers are not quite as interested in wild venison as they are in farmed is because of this lack of an audited supply chain. Conversations I've had with a number of people who are big buyers are, we don't know where it's coming from. We don't recognize the chill chain. We don't see it being recorded. We're nervous about its origin, and we're nervous about food poisoning someone. All that is covered off by the wild game guidance. We need to be looking at British quality wild venison. So we've developed a wild venison standard now to ensure that the supply chain is audited and can be audited. It's a sign-in process, and then you're audited on an annual basis. And we're working with Grown in Britain on this, all our stalking organisations and the end users and the processors. And we work with SAI Global on developing the standard. But go to the wild game guide and see what you can and can't do. But basically, there's two areas of sale. We're looking at the national sales process. We're looking at where we can get into the bigger market space, and supermarkets aren't necessarily the main outlet there here. We're looking at national government procurement. We're looking at universities. We're looking at where people use venison meat on a regular basis and could either swap or add in venison as part of their meal offer. So working with some of the big food supply chains like Sodexo and Bonaco. But if you're going to be supplying an AGHE approved game handling establishment, you need to be a trained hunter and you need to be registered as a food business. And this larger scale market is increasing, and there's definitely increasing interest in putting venison on the menus in hospitals. We're talking about prisons, we're talking about supplying the military, the MOD, and we're talking about sort of some of the high level sports games. We're talking to Twickenham, and we're talking to various others about getting venison into the supply chains. So that's a lot of the national work. And locally, the sale of venison, I think, is very robust. But you need to be trained hunter. You need a registered business. You need to be setting yourself up as a food business that can provide safe food. And when we say registered, it's registered with local authority. So that needs that sort of little bit of local engagement. But local sales are buoyant. There's a lot of people asking me for venison and saying, where can I find it? And I said, well, they've got stalkers all over the country, but it's linking those deer stalkers up with a processor and that end market. And that's up to everyone to sort of do that. It's up to everyone to find their little niche markets locally and supply the big game dealers who can then hopefully find these larger scale home markets as well. The nutritional benefit of venison is outstanding. It's for me, it's one of the best meats that you can find. We eat it pretty much every day at home. The children love it. All their friends seem to love it. And it's one of those meats that is low in fat. It's low in cholesterol. It's got a very absorbable protein. It's got low fat. It's got a really good source of iron. So it's a product that we should be using more readily, and we should be sort of seeing it as a more accessible everyday meat. The price points, though, have to work throughout the supply chain for the deer stalkers, for the landowners, for the people processing and the people selling. I was involved in a conversation recently where the supply chain included some wholesalers, and there's 4 or 5, 6 people in that sale chain before it got to the end user. And that end user was put off by the overall price of everyone having to add on their profit margins. So there are ways of shortening that supply chain, and that's the best way to going forward. So the British Quality Bar Venison Standard, it's there to support the venison supply chain across the British Isles. It's making sure that our standards are as high as any other food sector. What we're doing is we're moving food from the wild into a supply chain, and it needs to be safe, and we need to be treating it as such. So we need chillers, we need processing areas, we need extraction equipment, we need somewhere we can hang skinned and unskinned animals in separate containers, and we need to develop that local market. The local markets are good, but the local market needs to have the confidence in the product. And whatever you're selling, you need to have confidence in the product, whether it's that Honda quad or whether it's a piece of venison. You need to have confidence in the product. There's lots and lots of resources out there. There's a lot on gov.uk. There's a lot of YouTube type things. And there's a whole heap of links here for things like woodland creation, managing deer in the countryside, forest fencing, all the BAS codes of good practice, the British Quality Bar Venison. We'll supply these links to you. If you have questions, please ask. We've got teams across the country who can help. In the West Country, we've got the offices at Buller's Hill, and we've got people who can follow up with either emails or telephone conversations if you want more advice on anything. So please make use of us. Hopefully it's been a good insight into a subject that's been 30 years in the making, and hopefully we'll be able to see you all at some stage.
Thank you so much, David. I really appreciate that. We've had a sudden flurry of questions into the chat, so I'm hoping we can get through a few of these. A first question from Rob Joyce. Do you know what we can do, or what farmers landowners can do with the carcasses if planning don't allow deer larders? There's an acronym there that I'm not 100% sure of. What do you do with the carcasses as no AHGE?
AGHE, Approved Game Handling Establishment. Okay, so I had a conversation with Andy Gray at MC Kelly's last week. He's very keen that he develops sort of a larger scale market. So what was the question again?
It's great doing deer management, but what can we do with the carcasses if there isn't the larder?
Yeah, so we're hoping that there'll be chillers available in some of the new schemes. Certainly, if you're a landscape recovery project, there will be access to money through that, providing deer features as an objective of that scheme. Last year, we had chiller trailers in the Farm Equipment Technology Fund, which is a Forestry Commission administered grant for productive agriculture. The hope is that we get those back in there. So there may be chillers available through that scheme, and that'll be funded. Last year, it's funded, I think, at 60% funding. Local AGHEs, are few and far between. They're trying to develop their markets at the moment alongside the British Quality Wild Venison Standard. Had conversations last week, I say, with Andy Gray and looking at new markets for him. So he will want quality venison coming in. He's based down in the West Country. Talk to local butchers. Sometimes you need skinning areas because they can't deal with the skinning. So there's questions around it, but certainly, yes, you need an outlet for the carcasses. We can leave some for nature, depending upon where you are and whether that's appropriate. But carcasses are left for nature, and certainly some work in Scotland recently is indicating that a good percentage of the carcasses could be left on the hill to feed carrion, birds of prey, and also some really interesting bugs and beetles that are associated only to dead and decaying meat. So there's actually a benefit there if depending upon where you are, of course.
Thank you, David. I think that answers Rupert's question as well around the need for local larders. Is there something there as well around farmers, landowners maybe coming together when they're doing those joint applications for woodland creation to maybe think about pooling resources to kind of deal with the problem of carcasses if they know there's a significant problem in the landscape with deer?
Yes, I mean, and it's not associated just to woodland creation, it's associated to how we manage our whole landscapes. So the old concept of deer management groups still exists. We need ideally to work in collaboration with each other because these larders aren't cheap. So the green unit you saw in the 2 slides before I finished was best part of 55,000, and that was about 10 years ago. New larders between 45 and 150,000. If you're going to go large scale and local processing, a small scale chiller is going to set you back between 10 and 15,000, but that'll only be suitable for a small number of carcasses. So by working together, it's going to be much more effective and cost efficient, providing that you're not moving deer too far from your estate to that central point of collection. And then the Andy Grays of this world, the AGHEs, are more likely to be able to pick up from a central collection point than if you got 1 or 2 deer scattered across a whole area. So there's some good reasons for working together on this. And I know some of the pitfalls. It's not easy, but so work with it.
Yeah, I would also just say reach out to us in the Southwest. So we've got our deer officer in the Southwest who will have local knowledge around where you can potentially look at handling carcasses. So come and chat to us. We will provide contact details at the end. Unfortunately, David's in the East and East Midlands, but we do have our deer officer in the Southwest that'll be able to support. There is a question here from Paul about suggestions for protecting tree bark from rubbing. I think especially in an arboretum where the trees need to look attractive. So I'm not sure fencing or tree guards. I think they're looking for an alternative to that. Are there any, David?
Okay, so it's sort of trees in bespoke areas. I mean, it depends on the deer species you've got and what you want to do. I mean, a lot of the arboretum at Thetford, they put tree guards around every single one. So you've got your stake and your rails, so they look like a bit more like parkland trees that are protected from livestock, as opposed to a little plastic shelter. Control the deer. You could potentially, there's some sprays in Germany which are sort of based around, I can't remember what chemical was now, but you can spray it around areas and it will keep deer off for a period of time, but only weeks at a time. Sheep wool can sometimes help deter, but then that doesn't look very pretty. So it's really a combination of culling and probably some nice looking tree guards.
Great, thank you, David. We've also got a question here around grassland. So you mentioned that countryside stewardship WS1 can be used across moorland and grassland. Do you know where Steve can get further information around that? He's currently working on an application and a deer management plan, and it includes a large area of moorland adjacent to woodland.
So we're still trying to work out what the priorities will be. Obviously, anything in woodland is fine, and it's these other habitat types where we're working on guidance so we get consistency across the whole country. What we don't want to start doing is sort of doing little bits in our own areas and then suddenly find someone else isn't funding it somewhere, or they are funding it and we're not. So we're developing some national guidance on that at the moment, which will either share or work with the deer officers in particular areas as these applications come in. The fundamentals will be priority habitat and the current impact being found. So you do need to do your sort of risk assessments and baseline monitoring to demonstrate why it should be included.
Okay.
And it will be done on a case-by-case basis based from a local area team, and also have national guidance involved as well, so there's national consistency between the areas. Steve, sorry, I can't be a bit more precise than that, but it's very new, and we want to try and get it right so it's fair and consistent across the country. We
will provide links to the up-to-date published kind of lines to take on this, so they can have a read of that in more detail. I'll just come now to Michael Brown's question. Will the Forestry and Arboriculture Training Fund have a second wave, including deer management training funding? I believe the fund was entirely depleted in less than a day.
It was. I couldn't even get my son onto it because I missed the deadlines, and I just couldn't even get that. So it was really well taken up. There are training options within countryside stewardship now for deer management training. Whether it will come into the other fund or not, I've got no idea.
Thanks, David. And then we've got one from Sarah Noon. So Sarah works for a local authority and is working with numerous landowners on woodland creation. Is it possible for them to work together and put in an application as a local authority on behalf of the landowners relating to deer protection? So I
don't see why not. Yeah.
So if it's a England woodland creation offer, I think you can act as the agent, can't you? Even if you're a local authority on behalf of, you would need permission from a lead landowner, I believe, to put the application in on their behalf. But yes, you can work as a group, and there's also the woodland creation management grant, woodland creation planning grant, sorry. That would also lend itself to multiple landowners where you've got kind of woodland creation happening at scale. I think the minimum requirement is 5 hectares for that grant. Millie's kindly posted a link to that as well in the chat. But again, I will follow up with contact details, and if you have further questions, then please do let us know, and we'll find the most appropriate support for you. Unless we have any further questions, I think that's all of them for now. I'll just do one final shout out. Please do put in the chat if there is anything you've got a burning desire to have answered today. Otherwise, I'll say thank you so much, David. That was really informative. I really appreciate your going through that with us today. And
no problems.
There's no further questions, so I'll bring the webinar to a close and say thank you for your time, everybody. We'll follow up, be in touch soon. Thanks, David. Thanks, everyone.
No problems. Thank you.
Bye now.
Bye, everyone.